director of the IPPR in Scotland, but is no stranger to the STUC and has written many of the General Council statements and STUC policies over the years. So pass to you, Stephen.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. Delighted to be here. It's great to be back at Congress amongst old friends. We didn't plan it this way, but we're glad to note that our presentations have been complimentary. So Miriam's already very helpfully filled in a lot of gaps in what I'm about to say. I thought it'd be helpful if I covered my kind of strapline today is how to properly fund public services in Scotland. So I'm going to talk about what we need to think about in developing a tax strategy over the longer time that's going to meet that challenge. We'll focus in 5 key areas, but if we are going to meet the challenge of funding public services, if we're going to deliver the policy programme that we're discussing upstairs this week, if the First Minister is going to deliver on his 4 core priorities of eradicating child poverty, not just alleviating, eradicate child poverty, growing the economy, tackling climate change and delivering excellent public services, then reforming the tax system is going to be absolutely fundamental to that. So 5 points I would make in terms of how we think about that longer term strategy. The first one is, and I think it's kind of implicit in what Miriam was saying, total revenues will have to rise over time. We're not collecting enough tax in Scotland to deliver on what we want to do in Scotland. So if you think about the challenges there in terms of public investment, post 15 years of austerity, demographics mean that demand for public services, particularly in health and social care, is only going to go one way, and that is up. If we're going to effectively tackle the climate crisis, that implies all manner of public subsidies, both to private to households and to companies, to really make progress here. It implies a lot of spending. And I think as a country we need to decide how much of our collective resource and effort should go to meeting these challenges, and so doing avoid the cost of inaction. Tax is the means by which we deliver this collective action. I think it's also really important in this, and Jeanette will laugh because I've bored her for years over this topic, but we need to think about the nature of the services we deliver in the public sector, which are intrinsically labour intensive. They are people-driven services. And although I'm often frustrated by economics, got a love-hate relationship with it, one area in which economics is kind of really sound, with the theory and data match up, is how costs increase in labour-intensive services over time, always at a rate above the whole economy rate of inflation. And we can't pretend that hasn't happened, it won't continue to happen in the future. We need to engage with the reality of funding those services on that basis. The second point on this is slightly more provocative point, I think, but over the longer term we will all have to pay more. So not suggesting that this year the immediate challenges that Miriam described should fall on the backs of the lowest paid. But if, as a society, we want to make the choices that are going to allow the Foreign Minister to deliver his 4 priorities, we will all have to pay more. And I think in this respect it's quite instructive to look at countries that do manage to collect more tax every year than we do. So the Nordics, I know there's a wee bit of reluctance in Scotland to always be comparing myself to the Nordics, but nevertheless they collect round about an average 10% more of GDP tax every year than we do. How do they do that? They don't do it through highly progressive taxes. Everybody pays more. So in Denmark, the top rate of tax of 55% kicks in when you earn 1.3 times average earnings. If you think what that would mean in Scotland, so 1.3 times average earnings is around about 46k, so you'd be paying 55% on that, whereas at the moment your marginal rate is 42%. In Finland, top rate's 51%, kicks in 1.8 times average earnings. In Sweden, it's 45%, kicks in 1.1 times average earnings. So basically, once you're earning average earnings, your marginal tax rate is 45%. These are huge changes, but these are the countries which, as I say, collect more tax every year than we do, so I think it's instructive to learn from. Also, VAT, you often hear that there are debates around the tax, you hear it dismissed as a regressive tax, which it is. But it's also a tax that delivers year-on-year high and stable revenues which fund public services, and in those countries it's levied on everything, so you don't have exceptions. You have exceptions you have in the UK, and it tends to be about 26 to 28%. So there's some really thorny issues for us as a society to engage with. I think if we want to collect more tax, there's some really difficult issues around the tax we have to engage with, I think. The third point I would like to make, and Miriam touched on this, we should aim to tax more locally. So again, you look at countries that generate much higher revenues than we do, they collect much more of this, and this is in Dave's briefing for the Jamboree Foundation, they collect much more locally. Now again, really big challenges for us because people's willingness to pay that tax is clearly related to the level of engagement with and trust in the structures of local government. We're not there in Scotland at the moment. I think there's a massive challenge for us round about that. And indeed, the issue of trust is really important in terms of, again, you look at the countries that collect higher taxes, they've got much higher trust in government. Now, up until a couple of years ago, trust in the Scottish government was way higher than UK government. It's cratered over the last couple of years, and it's something that should really concern us all. So, I mean, if we are looking to generate higher revenues in Scotland, we have to think about the democratic system, what's working about it, what's not working about it, how we can change that nationally, but how we can change it locally. The fourth point, so Miriam spoke a fair bit about this, and we need to think about effective and sustainable ways to tax wealth, recognising that it won't be easy. Now, there are reasons why very few countries implement wealth taxes. It is difficult, but within the UK, wealth as a share of national income has increased 7 times since the 1980s. The taxation levelled on that wealth as a share of national income hasn't increased at all. So we need to be looking at creative measures, and Miriam spoke, I'll not repeat what Miriam said in that regard, but I think if there's any, if we're looking in Scotland about big commissions to think about really difficult long-term issues for the country, I think doing something about wealth taxation should be near the top of the list in that. Some countries do manage to achieve it, so Norway's got a well-established wealth tax that generates significant income every year. It's subject to constant and very often spurious attack. If you follow these debates online, someone's always having a go at Norway's wealth tax and the negative impacts of it. They very rarely stand up for the scrutiny, and this is a good tax which generates pretty steady revenues year on year. So it can be done, we can learn from it. But I think in terms of our challenges, it's probably not a solution to next year and the year after's fiscal problems. It's a longer term one, albeit the stuff we can absolutely do in the council tax in the short term. At UK level, absolutely stuff we can do with the capital gains. The fifth point is that tax policy should be an empirical matter, and we should all fight to ensure that it remains an empirical matter. We were just talking before the meeting started about some of the behaviours of some of the other very prominent think tanks across the UK and the way they address tax. Our Institute for Fiscal Studies, for instance, some of the work they've released in Scotland, I think, is not becoming of what is supposedly a serious think tank. So just before Christmas, they published a report which was very widely covered, very pejoratively covered in the Scottish media, basically saying the increase in the top rate of tax in Scotland last year is likely to have a negative impact in terms of revenues. But they concluded the report by saying, but we don't actually know because we don't have the data yet. So why even commenting on it? I mean, that is not okay. It's not something my think tank would do. It's not something that Miriam's think tank would do. Why are they doing it when this is supposedly their core expertise? So, I think we need to focus on what we know. I mean, as Miriam says, we know that since we've started saying the Scottish income tax schedule differ from the UK one, we have seen revenues rise, and in the last year for which we got full data, rise more strongly than the UK as a whole. Since 2017, when we've seen those systems diverge, we've seen net migration into Scotland increase significantly. So this idea again, which is widely propagated through the media, that if you increase taxes, people are going to leave. The opposite is true. People have decided to come here. As other heroes, people know, people decide where to locate and work on the basis of a whole series of issues. It could be house prices, family connections, desirability of location to live. Tax is only one thing that people think about in that mix. And certainly to date, for the data that we have, the solid data we have, there is no connection at all between higher tax rates in Scotland and people living in Scotland. We've just not seen that happen. And again, that's why we need to think about who higher earners are in Scotland, and they look very different to the UK as a whole. So the UK's top 1% is dominated by the kind of investment in the financial community in London. We've got a financial services sector in Edinburgh, but it actually looks pretty different to that London one, and an awful lot of the very high earners in Scotland, actually in the public sector, consultants in the health service, etc. So even if they decide to go, that tax liability stays where the job is in Scotland, so we need to be thinking these things through when we think about how we tax differently in the future. I mean, I should caution that there are lots we don't know as well, you know, so Scotland, as we all want to think that community of Scotland in a bit of a data desert, you know, and we don't really understand the full impacts of some of the recent changes to the income tax system yet, so I think it's wise to proceed cautiously. I don't think we want to be going by big step changes here that could cause some damage, but there's certainly scope to go further than we've already done. So I think I've covered the main points I was going to make one, so just
Okay.
leave it there and we'll take it.